I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Malanga, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. Steve is also a former executive editor of Crain's New York Business. Welcome to CityWide.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the Manhattan Institute is usually referred to in the media as a conservative think tank.
That's right.
So I want to ask you a question. Is George Bush a conservative?
He's probably more conservative than John Kerry. I think certainly on some issues he spent more money than conservatives would be happy with. So I'd actually probably call him a moderate.
Let me give you three examples, and because I think one of the things that's going on in this election is almost a redefinition of what is a conservative. Deficit spending, federalization of education through the No Child Left Behind, and the largest expansion of federal entitlements, prescription drugs, since the Great Society. Doesn't sound very conservative to me.
Well, I think that, it's very interesting. There is a redefinition going on because I think, let's take the education bill, because I think that's the one where you see most pointedly. There are conservative qualities in that bill, and that's where we see a new notion of what conservative is. Number one, trying to set certain standards. We're going to send money to school districts that teach reading programs and math programs that are scientifically proven to work, and we want to see results. Okay, that's now considered a conservative point of view, the idea that you actually have to see results in test scores. Okay, we'll give you money. We'll give you plenty of money. Okay, two, putting the money that they're putting into this education, there's been a big boost in federal spending in education, but putting that money specifically into instructional-based programs during the day, not into after-school programs, not into preschool programs, the kind of programs that sort of expand the educational bureaucracy, but don't necessarily or haven't been proven to actually improve test scores. That's now considered conservative. So you're right, in that respect, it's not about whether we're spending money or not, it's about how we're spending the money, and that's where the redefinition is.
In that arena, I think the president has lost a political opportunity. One of the arguments that he makes for the No Child Left Behind legislation was that he wanted to challenge what he calls the soft racism, that expectations for children in communities of color are too low. Because it's a way of saying we don't really believe that they can succeed no matter what we do. And Democrats have kind of ignored that argument, but you don't really hear other Republicans embracing it as a way to outreach to the emerging middle class in Black and Latino communities.
Well, I think you're right about that. And the truth is that if you look at the Republican agenda, particularly outside of the president himself, who I would argue actually is more concerned with urban issues than many Republicans, I think a lot of Republicans are somewhat clueless about what's going on in cities, and they're also clueless about policies. I often tell Republicans, if you look at what happened in New York City, if you look at some of the agenda of Rudy Giuliani, you actually have what I would call a Republican urban agenda. But no one's picked up on that to create that, to try to exploit that. So I would agree with you a lot that I think the Republican Party outside of the president particularly is a bit clueless about cities.
It was interesting at the Republican convention that they showcased their moderates. Schwarzenegger's politics coming from California, certainly to the left of a lot of the Republican Party, and Rudy Giuliani, who we in New York think of as a tough guy conservative. The national media was talking about his position on gay rights and gun control and choice. Is there also a battle going on sort of within the Republican Party on the social issues also? And is there such a thing as a Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party anymore?
I don't really think there's a Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. I think Rockefeller did his best to kill that. But these are very large parties, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and I think we see a lot of contending. I mean, look at the Democratic Leadership Council and the way they've tried to bring the Democrats back to the middle, and were enormously successful, one could argue, with President Clinton in doing that. So I think there's battles within both parties. But if you look at Rudy Giuliani, yeah, you're right. Rudy Giuliani has moderate positions, maybe even liberal positions on social issues. But Rudy Giuliani was brought up to speak about national security. He was brought up because of his point, his position, 9/11, because of his almost Churchillian status now. And I think if you look at it for that reason, I don't think there was any moderate ploy. I think he was serving the party as best he could in that speech.
I want to talk a minute about the president's tax policies, because the economic policy is something that you've written and thought about quite a bit. We are now back in a point of deficit spending, and there was a recent report that tax revenues are below what they were in 2000, despite the fact that there have been growths both in personal income and in corporate taxes. The conclusion one would draw is that the president's tax cuts contributed to the large deficit that the federal government now has. Was that the right choice that he made in terms of trying to come out of the bursting of the technology bubble? Should we be in this deficit position in a time of war? And do you think that additional tax cuts are the direction that the country should go in?
Well, I think, first of all, we almost have to be in this deficit position in a time of war. I think you have to separate the war out from the rest and ask, if we did not have that war spending, where would we be? And I think in that respect, it's not the tax cuts that I argue with, especially for New York City, but it's rather the increases in spending going along with the tax cuts, and especially the increases in social spending. And stand back and you think to yourself, well, wait a minute, we are trying to have it both ways. And although one would argue, and I would argue, that the idea of the tax cuts is to help us, grow out of the recession, if you are increasing spending at too quick a rate, you're simply not going to grow that quickly.
There was also a recent report of a headline from the New York Times earlier in the week: Republicans tried to dilute bill on taxing corporations. And obviously, different proponents of different measures will have different views of the merits, but the political thrust of it seemed to be that to win votes for various pieces of the tax bill, that certain tax breaks were being cut for special interests or industries in a particular legislator's state. To what extent do you think that by having become the majority party, the Republicans in Congress fell into the same trap that the Democrats did of having to reward their friends? In other words, the fiscal discipline that was promised in the contract with America seems to have been absent once Republicans got control of both houses.
Well, I would say, first of all, that it is an unfortunate function of our tax code right now that it is used by both parties to reward friends, and as a result, we have this complicated tax code full of all these unintended consequences. And a lot of these tax cuts never play out exactly the way you think. The Wall Street Journal wrote a very interesting story yesterday, for instance, about the way a tax cut that was a policy, a tax loophole that's being exploited by cities, most of which are run by Democratic administrations, is depriving the Treasury of billions of dollars. So I think that's an unfortunate part of our tax code, and the Republicans are as guilty as the Democrats. I think there's no doubt about that, and I am very much in favor of a simplified tax code.
In that vein, I've also been struck by the fact that the Kerry tax proposal, and basically to repeal some of the tax cuts for people who made $200,000 or above, that threshold number is probably unimaginable as an income goal for the vast majority of Americans. But in the city of New York, there are an awful lot of families that make $200,000 and above who would consider themselves, at best, at the upper end of the middle class. So how does that play out in a city like New York?
Well, you see, one of the ways I think it plays out is that what tax cuts are about really are not so much who we're rewarding as it is how much money can we pump into the economy. Okay, and we've done a study that's estimated that, let's say in 2004 alone, the combination of the two tax cuts basically kept $8 billion in personal income tax alone in New York City that otherwise would have gone to Washington, D.C. So that money comes from all across the spectrum. It comes from people making $35,000 a year because they got a tax cut, fairly substantial tax cut. It comes from people making $62,000 a year. They got a tax cut. But it also comes from people making $400,000 a year because they pay a lot of the taxes. I mean, I'll give you a very, very quick example. Someone making $35,000 a year, a single parent with two kids making $35,000 a year, in New York City is saving about $1,500 on their taxes. Okay? That's substantial. Someone making $400,000 a year in New York City, a family of four, is saving $11,000 on their taxes. Why? Because pre the tax cut, the $35,000 a year family was paying $1,700 a year. Now they're only paying $200 a year. The $400,000 a year family was paying $96,000 a year in taxes. Now they're paying in the $80,000. So they're paying the bulk of the taxes. Obviously, most of the benefits go to them, but the benefits are across the line. People in the $35,000 and the $62,000 a year range are receiving those benefits too.
Doesn't it push, though, some of the burden down to lower levels of government? Haven't we seen, as states cut taxes, the federal government cuts taxes, that property taxes, which are less fairly distributed, have gone up, local governments all over New York and around the country?
Yeah, but oftentimes they go up because local governments don't restrain their own spending. I mean, New York City is a good example of that. New York City has not, even in dire circumstances, cut its spending. It's increased its spending even in the recession years faster than the rate of inflation. It's continued to do that. So yes, if the federal government, now the federal government has the opportunity, obviously they can run deficits, okay? But if the federal government is in some way or another cutting their spending, then it's incumbent on the states and the cities to be doing that too. And the cities haven't done that. New York City clearly has not done that. They've opted for higher taxes rather than restraining spending.
We're going to talk about some more issues, both national and local, when CityWide continues right after this.
That I have to do. I don't have
What is this? Like a foot away from the trash can.
Yeah, hang on a second. You won't believe this. Please tell me somebody didn't just drop that there.
My husband would freak if he saw this.
Yeah, well, it's been there a while.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Man, I'm like this close to throwing it away myself.
I don't blame you. I mean, who would...
Don't just take a stand. Act. The most powerful way is to simply register and vote.
We are discussing the presidential campaign with Steve Malanga of the Manhattan Institute. Steve, last month on CityWide, I had Mark Green, who is the co-chair of the Kerry campaign, on. And we invited the Bush campaign, the Republican State Party, to try and send us somebody, offered them a couple of dates. I don't think it's me. I'm not Michael Moore or Al Franken. They just didn't seem to have a large number of spokesmen who were available to come on the show. Why isn't there more of a Republican Party presence in New York City? We had a Republican mayor for 8 years under Rudy. Bloomberg is at least ostensibly a Republican. George Pataki has been the governor for quite a while. Why isn't there more of a Republican
And he's
Party?
at least ostensibly a Republican too, right? That's a very good question, and I've actually written about that critically about the party quite a bit. I think the party is hiding in the sand, if you will. I think they're not keeping pace with changes in our society. I think there's enormous opportunity for them. We had a situation where you had 8 years of Rudy Giuliani as mayor. Here was someone who overwhelmingly won boroughs like Queens. I mean, won Queens in a landslide. And yet, the year that he won Queens, there were in 4 of the districts that he won more than 70% of the vote. There was no Republican running underneath him in either assembly. I believe it was assembly seats. They didn't even have people on the line. So I think that there is opportunity that they're not even taking advantage of. They're not reaching out, for instance, to new New Yorkers. If you look at the Hispanic vote in the last 4 mayoral races, it's gone this way for Republicans. It didn't just go this way for Bloomberg. It was trending that way. But one doesn't really see much of an effort to reach out there. So I think the party really is, if not dormant, I think it's bereft of ideas. I think it's institutionally not very vigorous. And we're seeing the result of that.
There's a overwhelming criticism of the way that Albany is conducting its business, and you now have some incumbents or people who are perceived as being incumbents because of their party support losing primary elections in New York up in the Bronx. A few.
A very few.
But it's not the kind of thing that ordinary voters seem to be talking about. What does it take to put together a real political reform movement in a place like New York?
Oh boy, this is the subject of an entire program. And let me say something first about that. I actually think that the reform movement in New York State should and could come from the top. New York State was blessed with, starting in the 1920s, a constitution that, a series of constitutional changes that made the governorship of New York State one of the strongest governorships in the country. The problem with New York State is that we've had, for the last 20 years, two governors who basically have abdicated their leadership role. They have not governed the way FDR governed, the way Dewey governed, even the way Rockefeller and Carey governed. And I actually think that that is where the reform movement starts, not in trying one at a time to defeat incumbents, in the Assembly and the Senate, which is going to take forever. The problem is that for some reason, the high-profile politicians in New York either want to run for mayor of New York City or they want to go down to Washington. And as a result of that, look at the candidates we've had for governor in New York. They've been appalling in the past. I mean, even Pataki was considered a lousy candidate and was really Mario Cuomo's election to lose. So I actually think that that's where reform starts, top down. I think this state has had a series of great governors who basically whipped Albany into shape, and that's not what we get anymore in this state.
What will it mean for New York, an overwhelmingly blue state, at least in this election? It's more likely than not that John Kerry is going to win the state of New York. What will it mean for New York if George Bush becomes the president? What would it mean programmatically, and what do you think it would mean politically?
Well, I think programmatically, the thing that will matter the most is if the president extends his tax cuts. We've projected if those tax cuts expire, it'll cost New Yorkers, within the next couple of years, $5, $6, $7 billion a year in lost tax increases. I also think that, in particular, if Kerry were to roll back the dividend and capital gains tax cuts, as he said he wants to do, particularly for higher income individuals, I think that would really hurt the stock market, and that would really hurt New York. Probably the best thing that the president's tax cuts did for New York, it wasn't even to keep money here, but it was through the dividend and capital gains tax cut, the incredible boost that gave to the stock market, which was at about 7,500 when people first started talking about that, and is now at 10,000. That's the thing that actually sort of has saved the city's budget. And I think if we lose those tax cuts in particular, the city's financial services industry will suffer, and as a result, the city's budget will suffer.
It's funny, New York has this anomalous position that I mentioned before in terms of the economy, because the industry of New York is really wealth. It's the creation of wealth. It's getting people to spend their money on fashion and jewelry. It's the stock market and all the services that surround that. It's that concentration of wealth. And maybe that's why so much of the rest of the country resents us, so that we wind up not getting a fair share of Homeland Security money to protect that wealth that everybody seems to agree that we need.
Well, there's a political disconnect, though, because New York is the center of wealth, and it is wealth. It is about creating wealth, but it's also one of the most liberal cities and one of the most liberal states. So there's this sort of disconnection, and I've heard all kinds of psychoanalysis of New Yorkers over the years. But we have a city where people create enormous wealth and vote Democratic, and not just Democratic, vote very liberal.
Let's talk about somebody who embodies that nexus, Michael Bloomberg. One of the wealthiest people in the world, elected as a Republican, but someone who unquestionably holds quite liberal political beliefs. How do you think he's doing as mayor?
Well, first of all, I would quibble with the idea of quite liberal. I think that, first of all, he's done a number of things which must be considered moderate. I think if he were a Democrat, he would be considered moderate. If he had run in the Democratic primary, he would have been somewhere around where Peter Vallone was, probably even to the right of Peter Vallone, who was at the time talking about tax increases, and Bloomberg was at least talking about holding the line on tax cuts and so forth. So I would call him a moderate. I think I think you get a mixed bag from him. I think he's clearly growing in the job. I thought in the beginning there was a certain amount of naivete, because one of the things he did is he came in and he said, I'm not going to govern the city ideologically. I'm going to manage the city. This was what the progressive reformer said at the turn of the 20th century. Cities don't have to be governed ideologically. Well, he soon found out that every decision you make actually is an ideological decision in New York. And so I think one, he hasn't done enough. He didn't do enough to restrain the growth of city government when we were facing this terrible post-9/11 situation. On the other hand, I think he's been what you would call somewhat conservative on the school system. A huge victory in getting control of the school system, a huge victory in talking about standards, a huge victory in ending social promotion. So I think he's sort of a mixed bag, and I actually think because he's learning on the job.
I want to ask you a question about his economic policy. A big part of his program is to rezone parts of the city that are underdeveloped and to create opportunities for growth. He's doing it in Brooklyn, Queens, and certainly in Manhattan. The Hudson Yards proposal, and we can talk about the stadium if you want, but that's not the thrust of my question.
We can certainly do that.
The Hudson Yards proposal adopts a principle that if you're going to create value in an area, tax revenues generated by that area are going to go up, that you should dedicate those revenues to paying the infrastructure costs of extending the number 7 line or creating parks or the stadium. As a matter of tax policy, is it a good idea to take that money and dedicate it in that way, or as a matter of policy, would we be better off creating the same value but having the money go into the general fund?
Well, I think that it's a risk, actually, the tax policy, because in a way, the city is not saying, here, we have the money and it's here. They're saying, well, once we create this plan, we'll generate the tax revenues and then the revenues will go over this. So the problem with TIFs, as they're called, and what you're referring to, is that they represent a risk that we don't actually ever find the money. Better to dedicate the money, but this is the problem. The city's budget is so squeezed that it can't quite find the money to do that. I think in particular, however, when you consider the investment that both the city and the state are going to make in the stadium, that, I think, increases the risk. So, I mean, that's part of the...
And another aspect of this, and although it's not so much being driven by Bloomberg or by Pataki, but used by developers, is the notion of using condemnation to take areas that are not clearly blighted, to take a piece of Times Square so that the New York Times can have a headquarters to build an arena in Brooklyn. As a matter of policy, how do you feel about the government using its condemnation powers in that way?
I think it's generally a lousy idea. I think because once government starts to do that, they start doing it in places where they think they know better than the rest of us. A perfect example of all this is look at the convention center. When we were first discussing expanding the convention center, the place we wanted to put it was owned by the developer Larry Silverstein up on 42nd Street, and they were going to use eminent domain to take it away from that. Well, because of political infighting, they never actually got to do that. In the meantime, what did Larry Silverstein do? He built an apartment building on that space. He created jobs. The private sector created housing. Isn't that smarter? So I think it's very dangerous when the government starts making these kinds of decisions, and that's why I'm really opposed to what's going on the far, far west side, the stadium and the expansion of the convention center. I actually think that that's the wrong option, although I support the idea of rezoning that area and getting some development going there.
My thanks to Steve Malanga of the Manhattan Institute for speaking with us today. That's all for this edition of CityWide. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us.